All right, very good. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm Jonathan Beater, Director of Public Works for the town of Plymouth. Didn't really expect anybody to show up this evening, so it's a pleasure to see you all here. We're expecting a good turnout, so this is great. Again, I know it's taking some time out of your evening, so again, it's a good thing everybody's here. So thank you. I do want to thank the Board of Selectmen for moving this forward in this capacity. I want to thank everybody that's put a lot of hard work into this. It's been a long time. A lot of dedicated employees and staff time have gone into just even this draft plan. With us this evening is Ryan Trahan. He's a project manager for Environmental Partners. Sheila Scarzi is the town's water and sewer engineer. Peter Gordon is our interim water superintendent. And then we have Anne Marie Patrica. She's our hydrogeologist. And Sarah Price, she's our senior engineer. So collectively, there's a whole group of us here this evening to answer any questions, and we really want to do things a little bit differently tonight. Instead of just, jumping into a PowerPoint presentation and kind of going over a lot of the details this evening, we really want to kind of have an open dialogue. I think it's a much better use of time to answer questions and have that dialogue this evening to really gauge where we are and figure out the best way to move things forward. Just to make a good use of time. But we're happy to run through the presentation later on. There are some good pieces of it. We were back with the Board of Selectmen back in November, and I see Selectman Flaherty and Selectman Tavares here, so thank you very much. So they are here in the audience this evening. That's great. So we were with the board back in November. They requested that we move forward with this forum and others, depending on the interest and what type of conversations we have going on. But we did revise that presentation. This will all be online. And we will distribute that. So depending on how the Q&A goes, we can run through that afterwards if we have the time. The other thing too, please, in the back room, there's a sign-in sheet. We ask that you sign that and give us an email address so we can communicate effectively with everybody if we have future information to release or another meeting. And then if you have questions, please use the microphone. PAC TV is here this evening. Thank you very much to broadcast this at a later date so the public can see it and watch and understand what it is we're doing. So really quick, we put this flyer out a couple weeks ago to try to get as much attention to this as possible to get everybody on the same page as us with the forum and just an understanding of what we want to do and how we want to do it. But I really want to take a couple of minutes right now to really talk about the master plan. Years ago the town performed a master plan. They put one together, and what those documents do is that they're really a tool for us as public works people to run the system. It's an operational tool. It tells us what to do for infrastructure in terms of improvements. It tells us how to make sure we're running the system properly in terms of a regulatory capacity. It tells us what we're not doing right in the system, at a pump station, at a valve station, at a tank. So it's really a great planning tool for us. In addition to that, it really is spelling out your capital needs, your infrastructure needs over the next 20 years. The plan and working with environmental partners, it really rolls in our new water withdrawal permit. It understands, it's really like a real-time document where it understands development and what our needs are to help us through the process. So that's it, that's the main driver. It's about sustainability. The other piece is we understand we need redundancy. We need to make sure the system is resilient. So we're looking for additional water supply. And that's brought up in the document as well. And those are really our focuses, but we really appreciate and understand the intentions and the questions and how the public is eager to get into the weeds of the document in terms of conservation and protecting the aquifer. And we are as well. I do want to say that, our withdrawal permit spells out a lot of those things, and we're going to put that online too, and we can answer questions on that as well. We're in the second year of our new water withdrawal permit, and that will carry the town until 2030. And that document really spells out how much water we can pull out of the ground on an annual basis, okay? And again, we'll put that information out there. The other piece is, it is a 20-year tool that we'd like to have on the books, so we really want to make sure that it's a comprehensive document and that it's complete. So for us as water purveyors and operation, the people that are running the system, it's important to have those pieces together, but again, we want to make sure that we are protecting the environment. And here in Plymouth, the one thing I have learned, I see a lot of familiar faces here this evening, is the environment is critical. When we were developing Forges Field and 200 acre, we went through a tremendous exercise in the impacts to adjacent water bodies. And, we're aware of that. We did that with Forges. And as we move forward with other supplies, we will continue to do that, and we will hold fast in that effort. But I want to just really take a second to recap what we've done, because with the selectmen's support, town manager support, town meeting support, staff support, we have really transformed the water system. You know, I started working here in March of 2011, and one of the first projects we did was we replaced 3 miles of water main, you know, mostly in the downtown area. And the reason we did that is because we had a tremendous amount of leaks. Our overtime was really through the roof. We were spending a lot of money. It was old pipe from the early 1900s, and we had a number of breaks, and that was causing pressure problems in the system. So we repaired that. After we did the jacketed main, we really started looking at the water tanks. You know, those tanks, they're on a plan, again, regulated by the DEP. We have to paint the interior and exterior of those structures, and we started putting mixing systems in those tanks to really, you know, move the water around, especially during the summer when it warms up. So we've been having you have a very aggressive tank maintenance program. You know, it's a spectacular program. We're very proud of it. A lot of towns look at how we do that. In addition to some of the infrastructure, you know, we looked at the administrative side of things. We've looked at our billing. We looked at our meters. So as I think most of you are aware, we've done a full meter replacement program that really catches us up in terms of accuracy, because as meters age, we lose the ability to meter the flow, the volume. We're missing volume. So by changing out all the meters, we have a much better reflection of what the consumption is on that side. So that was important. We've also worked very closely, you know, with finance and the Board of Selectmen to look at your block rates and your rate structure. We added a 4th block rate a couple of years ago. We've gone to quarterly billing. So we have really done a really good job in terms of managing the rates, consumption, infrastructure. And this plan will really take us through the next 20 years again to make sure we're doing a good job at that. The other piece is conservation. You know, we have questions. We've received about 5 or 6 questions through email. We've received a couple more this week. All very good, solid questions. And a lot of them are, what are we doing about conservation, and what are we doing to protect the aquifer? So in our new withdrawal permit, the DEP has goals. They set, you know, limits in terms of how much water we can use, as I mentioned a little while ago. But they have a recommendation in terms of they want us to be at 65 gallons per day per person per capita, and they want us to have 10% or less unaccounted for water. I can tell you right now, we are there in both of those capacities, which is a very good thing. A lot of communities aren't there. So Plymouth's pretty good. We do leak detection to make sure our system is tight. We don't have leaks, so that's an ongoing annual thing we do every year. I believe we got a grant last year for some leak detection, which was great. And lastly, you know, we talk about outdoor water use and, you know, how the town can best control that and how do we manage that into the foreseeable future. And the DEP is well aware of that. You know, they want us to make sure, the DEP wants us to make sure we have plans and procedures in place to control that. So last year, we did a mandatory water ban, and that was gauged on stream flow. We have a well at the airport that we monitor, so when that level drops below a certain elevation, we have to institute a mandatory water ban. This year, our permit requires us to do that automatically come May 1st. So that will happen. You'll see information come out in late April as far as moving that forward. So that's something that's going to happen automatically. And again, we can go into some of those details if people have questions in a little while. The other piece that we hear a lot about is the projects, the level of development. You know, how is the DPW working with planning and zoning and permitting these massive projects? Because they're coming fast. And it's a lot of work. And, you know, we sit down with the developers. We do a peer review. Environmental Partners has been looking at our water systems for a number of years. Actually, Ryan has worked on the water system for more than 10 years, I think. He's very knowledgeable of it. He understands it. We built a hydraulic model, so it's all computerized, so we know if somebody connects to the system and they provide us with their flow use, we know what the flows are in the area. We can show what those impacts are. So we do that on every project. We require that on every project. So we can make sure that there's proper redundancy. We can provide proper water, and we have the resiliency to make sure that those systems can operate properly. But at the same time, we know what the conditions are in Plymouth. And what's truly unique in Plymouth is you have a very large, sophisticated water system. You have 6 pressure zones. And Peter, Sheila are constantly working and figure out the best ways to move that water, especially during max day demand. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of this in the past, you know, working through the project, you know, in front of the selectmen where, you know, Plymouth has had a hard time meeting max demand. And there's a thing that the DEP refers to as firm capacity. And what firm capacity is when you're large, the firm capacity issue is that the state looks at the town, they want you to be able to provide drinking water when your largest water source is offline. So as we permit these projects, we say, okay, we're going to take this well offline, and can we meet max demand? So these are the exercises that we go through when we look at all these projects. So it's a very rigorous, resilient process. And we also do try to work with mitigation with these developers in terms of, do we need main upgrades? Do we need additional connections to make sure that we have that redundancy, to make sure we can meet the flow? And most importantly, we're not negatively impacting our system. And all of this combined is really part of the focus of the master plan. The master plan really takes it to the next level, and it provides us a planning tool. So if we get a development in West Plymouth or in Manomet, we know how that system's operating, and we know what we need to ask for and what we need to do. So that's really what that tool is for us. But again, overall, the town has done a lot in terms of infrastructure over the past couple of years. This document is critical to us in terms of a planning document, and I think we definitely need to take some time to roll in everybody's thoughts and concerns into that document, because again, it's going to be on the shelf for 20 years that we pull off every now and again to use. So I think what I'd like to do, and if it's okay with everybody in the room, is to really just, we'll go back and forth, we'll answer some questions, and if we have some time, we'll really run through the presentation. Informal, open, but again, I just ask everybody to use the microphone. I think we have till about 9 o'clock, and I think we'd like to use that time to the best of our advantage, our abilities, and then we'll come up with a plan on how we move it forward. Okay? Any questions? Thoughts? No? Very good. So, I'm trying to think. Yeah, why don't we do that? Let's see that. So what we did is when we put out this flyer, we put an email address for questions, and we have received several questions. And we rolled them in here, so we could start with these. So the first question, has the Water Division considered impact offset programs? So the Water Division complies with the requirements of our Water Management Act permit. So water conservation and mitigation credits. That's currently what we do. We also do peer reviews, as I mentioned, on any and all proposed developments, and we request mitigation to offset those impacts to make sure we have that available capacity. And third, Water Balance Program is a suggested program to implement as outlined in the master plan. So the master plan does bring it up, and it's something we consider in detail and discuss as we move forward, in terms of, future offset programs depending on need and what we want to do with the plan.
Could you go back on that? There's a lot of terminology in that I'm not conversing in. The impact offset programs, could you explain what the question means and what your answer is?
Could you just do me a favor, Frank? Could you use the mic?
You heard.
Okay, so the question is, can we explain a lot of the all the terminology in the question, because it is technical.
Yeah, I can take that one. Again, my name is Ryan Tran with Environmental Partners. In layman terms, anytime a developer comes in, they have to provide an estimate of how much water that they intend to use with their development or commercial activity. And we take that and kind of view what kind of impact it could have on the water system through our review and input into the hydraulic model. But also, the offset program can help not only mitigate direct impacts that they may have, like say it may cause one of your pumps to run longer, but the water balance program could be something that the developer would have to directly offset. Say if they're going to take 10,000 gallons in usage every day, well, they have to provide savings of 10,000 gallons of water per day through either leak detection or use of, like say, no water urinals or things along those lines of maybe not using irrigation or different kind of plantings on site. So there's different ways that they can get credits within a water balance program to offset how much water that they would take on a daily basis.
Any other questions on that question? All right, so question 2.
I think I have a question.
Yes, sir.
And I don't know if it fits. Is this the microphone?
Yes, please.
I'm Peter Neville. I'm from Precinct 10. Summer Reach came online and uses a lot of water. We've got the apartments coming in at Home Depot, 360. We've got condos coming in over at Colony Park, another 300. I don't know all of the different developments that are on the table, but it strikes me that the volume of water that's going to be consumed, given Summer Reach is online, and the projects that are coming online, there's going to be some kind of an impact on the availability of water currently and in the future. And I don't know if that anticipated usage is the pig in the snake's body, or it's pretty usual. I mean, so that's a layman's question.
We're just gonna, I think the easiest way to answer that question is if we go into the presentation and we look at your water system and how it functions now to meet max demand. Let's see. Is that up front? I'm going down. Wrong way. Excuse me. Right there.
So when we looked at those developments as well, those are in a section of the master plan included of known developments sort of at the time that the master plan was written, and added to sort of the bottom line demands that we saw on an average basis and what we projected going forward. So this, do you have the pointer?
Yeah.
So this slide here shows you in blue here, in the solid blue line, what the average or historic by year demands are. This is in the max day. Here is the average day demands, okay? These are the projections of what we're projecting for water use. And this solid black line that goes up like this, that's the current firm capacity. So through the year 2019 and early parts of 2020, we are below the max day demands with the firm capacity. And as JB mentioned, that's when our largest well is offline. It's very normal in a water system due to some of the age of the infrastructure to always plan to have one well offline just in case of emergency or in times if, say, if a pump has a mechanical failure or vice versa. So it's a good planning mechanism. This uptick here is we're just about 75% complete with a brand new well station at Forges Field. As you remember, that was a town meeting article about a year and a half ago. So that's just about to come online in early parts of 2020. So that will get us back up to almost an equal position as far as planning for firm capacity. You can see here that on an average basis, most of the year, the town has no issues meeting demands, even if some of their wells are offline. Okay, the firm capacity is way up here, and here's the average demands. It's really that time in the summer that there's the issue where moving water from the zones is tough, especially when it seems like a lot of the development has been in the West Plymouth area and in Colony Place. You'll see in some other capital projects here that we're recommending is, one of the big ones is the ability to connect the northern zones with the eastern zones, the Manamet and Cedarville area, to be able to truly move water in any direction that you want in the water system, which will make you have a lot more redundancy in times of need in different parts of the water system. And that would truly get you to a point where you could satisfy yourself well into the 2030s as being able to supply more than enough water in the summer and definitely more than enough in the average day demands.
And just to touch on another point, so when we do these peer reviews, so you mentioned, you were specific in your projects, when we look at, Colony Place, some of the housing there, and we look at the Oasis off of Home Depot Drive, those volumes are in this equation, as we project out into future years. So as we do as we do a hydraulic model, as we do a peer review, we understand where that baseline number is in terms of meeting demand during, while we're holding that firm capacity number. So, the master plan really, again, I mentioned the focus on infrastructure, and that master plan is really spelling out, your capital plan, and so this is your capital plan for this year. Again, we're looking at new sources, Manomet zone pipe upgrades, and that's because we have a restriction in Manomet before we do an interconnect to move water, in a much better way. And then we have power upgrades at Darby, and then we have other pump station upgrades. So this is your capital plan this year, and then in the following subsequent year, we're going to actually be looking to make that connection happen. And at that point, we'll reach that line which Ryan mentioned a little while ago in terms of being able to provide plenty of volume until at least 2030.
That's the second question.
Sure?
So it strikes me this is all about public water supply.
That's correct.
You're taking water out of the ground and distributing it through an infrastructure that we pay for through town meeting and pipes. So I live in a house that has a well. So I'm taking water out of the ground. And occasionally, in the almost 14 years I've been here, the well has gone dry. And coincidentally, it's been at the same time that they're flooding the bogs down on Black Cat Road. I don't know if there's any correlation to that, but by way of an example, is private well consumption equal to or greater than the consumption in the public water supply? And as you put them two together, are we still okay? Because all of this is about public water, right?
Correct.
So where does Joe homeowner that's got, a spike in the ground and drawing some water out? So it's 200 feet down. Thank you.
So, I'm very curious, show of hands, how many people are here in this room are hooked up to town water? So a good amount, I'd say 50% of the room. So,
How about if you ask how many people are connected to a well?
How many people are on a well?
opposite, how many people are on a well? Yeah. Maybe more than half, more than half.
Is that correlated with what the town's like?
Town has 14,500 connections. I think it's what, 60, high 60%? 65% of the town is on municipal water. So that's just a rough ratio. But, the Board of Health, permits and oversees, private wells. So again, as it was mentioned, the water master plan is part of the municipal water supply. We're permitted and regulated from DEP as a public water supply. We don't get into the private wells, and this master plan doesn't talk about the private wells.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
Because if you have half the people here tonight who are on wells and not on municipal water, one of the things that I think this gentleman brought up is what happens if you drill new test wells, draw down the level of the water table that is available to all those people that are currently on private wells? What happens to them?
Yeah.
Because that's a substantial population here in Plymouth.
Sure, and it's a phenomenal question. So when and it was real recently where we permitted forges, and we looked at 200 acre, and we did a tremendous amount of analysis in terms of what those impacts would be, because when you basically permit and eventually install a well, the DEP requires that you do a series of testing. And they're referred to as drawdown tests, where we actually install a well and we actually pump that well. Brian, can you kind of just go into that, the drawdown testing and what we need to do, Anne Marie?
Okay,
There you go.
there we go. When we permitted, say, the Forges Field well, they require you to install your test well and pump it at the rate that you want to pump the well at. So in this case, it was 1 million gallons a day. And we had to have wells at different distances from that public water supply well. So we can measure how that pumping is going to affect the aquifer. And we measure, each of these wells tells us what the aquifer is like as you get further away. And we take all that data, we put it in a groundwater model with the goal of evaluating the distance and drawdown. How far out will you affect the water levels? In the case of Forges Field, we looked at all the private wells in the vicinity of Forges Field and evaluated how that would affect each well. And at this point, we'll even put a well between the public well and the private wells just to monitor that drawdown. But we're always conscious of that. And usually we go above and beyond what DEP requires just because we want to make sure that we've always done this with all our water supplies.
Did that answer your question? Yes. Okay, very good. Any others on question 1?
Yeah.
I didn't expect to have multiple questions after one question when we post. I didn't expect this.
I'm interested in the fact that sounds good, but I want to give you an example of exactly the study that was done. Now, I realize it's not the next well to be drawn down, but there was talk of putting a well on the 200 acres at Clark Road. And the fact that it would only draw down a little long pond by 6 inches. Wasn't going to be much. Now, the average depth, or the deepest part of Little Long Pond is 15 feet. You draw down vertically 6 inches, and you're left with a mud pile there. So you have a problem there in terms of what this is actually doing compared to what that show is. And I think that somehow we haven't gone far enough, and I'm not saying you're right or wrong, I don't think this goes far enough in telling us that if we were to build out Plymouth, and there is a build out for Plymouth, then you have to use that as the master plan and part of the master plan. And I don't think you've done that yet to find out what the total effect will be. So I'd just like some input on that. I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in order to make it a true master plan that covers the issues that are going to go on in the future that have not yet been addressed.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Judy Savage, and I live on Little Long Pond, and I have a well, and I'm concerned for the reasons Pompey said, but I'm also wondering on the models that you're using on public water supply. Do any of those models take into consideration some of the predictions they're now having with sea level rise? Have you had any of your models that you're using projecting what the effects of sea level rise in Plymouth, that is one of the largest coastal communities in Massachusetts, the effect that's going to have on our aquifer, and then in turn the effect that's going to have on our wells? And I just think, I admire how much work. I mean, it's a huge, comprehensive document. But we're in the midst of some enormous environmental shifts right now. And I think much of the modeling that we're using in the past that has worked is not going to be sufficient for what we're going to be facing in the next 30 years. So if this is a 30-year plan, I didn't see much referencing that and that data that's coming out. We may not even have it, but we're getting really anxious about what the impact. We're worried about, as with sea level rise and whatever impact that's going to have on the aquifer, how much salt water are we going to get in our wells? We're worried about the restrictions on where our septic systems are and the proximity to our water supply, how that's going to change. Because when you start drawing more water out of the ground, and we don't really know what the impacts are going to be, it's going to impact our septic systems, it's going to impact our wells. And if we get stuck in a model that's not going to work for our real future, we're going to be in trouble. So that's the kinds of things we really want this plan to address, in addition to everything else that's addressed.
Just a quick comment, and maybe Anne Marie can help me out with this one. I will say that we're well aware of the impacts when we put a new well in. I mean, I think we really analyze them as much as we can in terms of what the drawdown is, what the safe yield is, and how that actually impacts the aquifer. The technology is there. I think it's a lot better than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. and it affords us a really unique ability to look at adjacent ponds, private water supplies, and see what the impact is, given how much we're looking to permit that well for. And, we're referring to Forges a lot. We know that was a net 1 MGD well, and we know what the impacts are. 200 acre was a much different scenario, given all the adjacent ponds, and you know what, that's why we kind of started looking elsewhere because of the impacts. We were aware of that. But I will say, in terms of sea level rise and the impact on the aquifer, I think the technology will continue to change. So, as we look at, future water supplies and developing and installing wells, hopefully we have technology that can look at that, depending on what the sea level rise it is and how it may impact the aquifer. So I do think it's a case by case. I don't think we can look at the town as a whole when it comes to sea level rise for water supply purposes. But I do hope and I do strongly feel that the technology will be there to analyze that when that need arises. Anne Marie, anything to add?
I have a couple things to add to that. One, going back to the master plan, in terms of what the goal of the new source study was, let's just identify potential sites. It was an initial screening based on what's available in online databases through DEP and where our sensitive environmental receptors are, where are the landfills and has waste sites, things we don't want to be around. And once we narrow it down to some priority sites, then the goal is we pick out these sites and then we do the extensive modeling. We put in a well, we see what the geology is there, first of all, because you really need that to do the modeling. And that's the next step. So that's really hard to incorporate into the master plan, but that's how it would proceed. And we can add a sentence or two to explain what the next steps are when we identify a site. And the models do have the capability of addressing climate change, sea level rise. We always work with the latest USGS models that are really on the forefront of a lot of the climate change. And, in the case of 6 ponds, we actually did discuss with the modelers how the current climate change model would affect a pumping well there and impacts to private wells and the ponds. So we did consider that, and in the future, obviously, that's going to be significant. We have the capabilities to look at sea level rise and saltwater intrusion or saltwater upconing along the coast, and we've done it for a lot of towns, so that's definitely something that would be considered at the next level.
Thank you. Any other questions on question 1? Yes, Frank.
Hi, Frank Mann, Chilton Street. I am on town water. I'm worried a little bit about the overall attitude, the models that we use now, that they are how much can we draw down in the future, not how little we can draw down. So, one of the things that's happened in recent years is the reduction in the amount of approvable gallons per day per person. Is that what the, PPPDPD, whatever it is? Are we anticipating in these models that will also reduce, that maybe we'll be at 45 in 20 years? So really what we should be doing is, I think the model should be about how much we're going to conserve, not how much we're going to use. That's all I have to say.
Another valid point, Frank. I don't think I can tell you right now, the town of Plymouth is not maximizing withdrawal. It's a number of things come together, but it's definitely a balance. So we know what we need in terms of levels of economy to construct a well. We know they're expensive, and we know we need a certain, volume of water to make sure that those are feasible in terms of installing a well, because it could be several $1 million. So we know we're not going to spend several $1 million to pull 100,000 gallons of water out of the ground. But at the same time, we're very aware and sensitive to the environment. So we would never, permit or try to maximize a well knowing it's going to have a negative impact on the aquifer. Perfect example is 200 acre. So, to answer the question, we're not going to try to maximize the withdrawal amount knowing it's going to have a negative impact. There's a balance, and, DEP is aware of that, and we're aware of that, and that's how we will move forward in any future water supply. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Eric Cody, I live in Ellisville, and I both have a well and on town water. I should also mention, I also have 40 years' experience in utility planning and policy analysis, albeit on the electric side, but the parallels between electric and water are striking. We have the same charts that you do for capacity planning, with one big difference. We plan out business as usual, what demand is growing at over a 20-year period. We figure out when our firm capacity is not adequate to meet that, including reserve margins and redundancy and contingencies and so on, to plan for forced outages. But what we do is we actually adjust that curve two ways. We build up supply and we reduce demand. I mean, I think what's missing, and I said this before the select board in November, is there's no attention being paid to conservation in this plan. I mean, on page 74, I've looked at it over and over again. On page 74, conservation, the words that are used with conservation are should and could. I'm here to say that the word that should be substituted for that is must. My belief is if you've got 3 wells out there in the next 10 years, scheduled in with this business as usual case, and by the way, I challenged the 65 gallons per capita per day. I think we're fortunate that we've got a lot of seasonal homes in Plymouth. I mean, what would happen if short-term rentals all of a sudden start filling those up with people? Plus, we don't meet that every year. It's weather dependent, among other things. And there are, in fact, somebody earlier said, could we get down to 45 or 50 gallons a day? There's already a Massachusetts community that has implemented conservation and is at 47 gallons per capita per day. It's Franklin. And Franklin's case is worth paying attention to. Back in the 90s, in the 60s, Franklin put in a well that actually impacted a kettle pond. You know, you talked about the impacts on ponds. The acreage on the pond surface shrunk enough that when Franklin came in the 90s asking for permission to drill 2 more wells, they hit a roadblock at this, you're probably not familiar with MEPA. It's the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. All projects like this have to go through MEPA to decide whether or not you need to do an environmental impact report. That's a heavy lift. You don't want to come out with a decision that you need to do one. Well, Franklin went in and there was opposition to the wells, so they came out with, yes, you've got to do one. And oh, by the way, we want to see conservation, demand management, and rate restructuring, rate design in there too. Franklin didn't like that. I know this because I talked to their DPW director yesterday. And by the way, he spoke highly of Mr. Beater. But they undertook a conservation program in the 90s. By 2010, they'd reduced overall water, total water consumption in the town by 15%, 4 million gallons a day that they didn't have to draw out of the aquifer. And that was in spite of the fact that they'd added 4,000 new homes in that period. So they have not built a well in Franklin since the 90s, and they're relying on conservation instead. And I can tell you, you know, it's an interesting story. It's not all, you know, apple pie and sweetness. There was some ups and downs in this journey that they went on, but they've eliminated both of those wells. And in my mind, what ought to be in this plan, the central element ought to be let's investigate all the conservation measures we can possibly get our arms around and target those wells. I mean, it can be done alongside this master plan in parallel with it, but the target ought to be to eliminate $20 million of capital. And I'm hoping that Mr. Beater, that you will launch a working group or something that delivers within 6 months a 5-year conservation plan for this town. I really, there's nothing that I'm aware of that we can say that, okay, these conservation, other than outdoor watering bans, what conservation measures have we implemented in the town that have gotten us down to a level of consumption that we're comfortable with? I mean, I think the plan is still woefully deficient in terms of the lack of emphasis that it places on conservation and peak management. We've got the data, we've got the new metering system, we have another information gathering system called SCADA, which handles the, you know, the tanks and the major pressure points and so on. If you put those together, I think we've got the basic information foundation to do a whole lot more than we're doing now. And I hope that we can do something to integrate that kind of stuff into this plan. Thank you.
So just a couple of, you know, responses to that. in terms of what we do at conservation. So the Water Division does, provide, water savings devices, low flow devices, and we could definitely try to market that in a different capacity than we have. When we review projects, we definitely require all these developers to use, low flow devices, water savings devices. We require them to, put infiltration systems, in the ground for roof and clean runoff to basically infiltrate as much runoff as possible back into the ground. So, when you talk about development projects, I think we're doing as many conservation measures as possible. But remember, for us as a public water supply, a lot of it has to do with, Plymouth's growth. I totally respect the Franklin piece, and I understand that, pretty well. Plymouth has been growing pretty rapidly over the past couple of years. And the whole thing for us is, we have been deficient in terms of meeting that demand. So I do respect the conservation element, and we can have that conversation as far as, how do we beef that up and how do we move that forward in a better capacity, and there are different means to do it. But at the same time, we know we have infrastructure needs of the community in terms of, meeting that max day demand, and it's our responsibility to provide that capital and make sure that infrastructure work gets done and we maintain the system properly. And a lot of that funding comes from the ratepayers. And I'm sure many of you know it's an enterprise fund. It's not, subsidized by the general fund, and that's a very good thing. So all the ratepayers bear all those costs. And what we have done, and this comes right back into that conservation argument, we've spent a lot of time over years when we set those rates to make sure we generate revenue, to make sure we encourage conservation by adding, for example, that fourth block rate, a higher block rate, because those are where the heavier users are. And absolutely, this new meter program is going to provide us benefits into the future with technology. Green meters. We get a lot of questions about green meters and sewer flow and all of those questions. We will get there. But again, we need to take one step at a time. And I think I know the meters will provide a very unique ability for us to basically say, hey, listen, Frank on Long Pond Road is utilizing X amount of water because we know he's watering his lawn because we can see it during the day. We'll have that ability in future years. And that will provide us another way to bill appropriately to conserve water. So there are a lot of mechanisms in place, and I know that a lot of public works out in the West Coast employ those measures, and the trend is all the things that they do out west to conserve and promote water slowly moves over to New England. And us as public works professionals, we get that and see that. So I do think it changes. I don't know, Ryan, if you have anything to add. Ryan does a lot of work in other communities with master plans on the conservation piece.
Yeah, so just to speak a little bit to that. So Plymouth the last 3 years has done a better job of getting down underneath the residential per capita. The times where I've seen communities get into the 50s is mostly related around to higher density, mostly into some higher density towns and cities, but also people that have really ratcheted down on use of irrigation on public water systems, and also trying to implement restrictions on private wells, which I know could be a sore subject, and maybe only about 25% of the towns that I work with actually have a bylaw to that effect. Pembroke, for example, if you look back at some of their numbers, I think back maybe about 10 years ago, they banned all use of irrigation systems on public water, and it really had an impact and dropped their residential per capita use. So Plymouth, and when we talk about water use projections, all the projections that we made were at the rate of the residential per capita that's within the Water Management Act permit from DEP. So we're not assuming a long-term historical high average. We're assuming what Plymouth is required to meet their permit, and that's what's used for the water use projections going forward for the future. So, to echo JB's comment, it's mostly related to development and sort of catching up with the amount of development that's happened in the recent years, moving forward with the 65 residential gallons per capita, and looking forward to make sure that you can meet those needs.
Thanks. I do appreciate those measures that you are taking, and I recognize how much work went into this. I wanted to pick up on something that Mr. Cody mentioned regarding private wells. He mentioned briefly that there are more and more people moving in to, say, grandma flats and so forth. But it must also be factored in that many people who were summer residents are becoming year-round residents. It's a phenomenon. It's happening rapidly. And I wonder if the town has taken into consideration the fact that wells that already exist, private wells that used to be used by summer people, are being used all year round now, and will be used more and more all year round. And that will have quite an impact on the aquifer, an impact that may not be measurable.
Could you just do me a favor and not hold the mic? I think that's creating some
Oh, I'm
feedback
sorry.
issues,
Yeah.
but that's okay.
So I wonder if the town has taken that into consideration. I also wondered if you have instituted any measures to deal with, you talked about irrigation, to deal with golf courses and with cranberry bogs, major users of water. Thank you.
Yeah, so you had a couple questions there. I'll start with the last ones first. Cranberry bogs, a lot of the cranberry growers have first rights when it comes to water. I can just make reference to Darby Pond. You know, so Darby Pond well, we have restrictions, and those restrictions go into effect in terms of us, you know, withdrawing water because the level of the pond drops below a certain elevation, and that's due to the fact that the cranberry growers had first right to that water. So they had the right before we do. So the cranberry growers, I mean, that's a unique situation, case by case, but you know, they have many of them have the right to the water before the towns do. As far as the seasonal piece goes, I want to say we have about 1,200 seasonals.
430.
400. We have about 430 seasonals that generally the water division, you know, does, you know, shut-offs, turn on and offs during the season. So I think, I mean, it is a kind of a small number, but, you know, we're not tracking those. I don't think we've rolled that into the master plan per se in terms of what the impact is if they do go year-round. But again, we do know what their impact is. It is during max day demand during the summer months. So I think that is really kind of already balanced into the master plan in our math and our analysis, because when they are using water, it's during max day demand.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
When we do the groundwater modeling, in a lot of areas, we take into account private wells. And one of the advantages with a private well is you have your well and you have your septic system. So in general, the USGS says 70% of the water you take out from your well recharges directly to your aquifer. So you don't have 100% impact on that aquifer. And then in the area where we are in Plymouth, the Plymouth Carver Duxbury aquifer, the recharge to the aquifer is on the order of over 1 million gallons a day per square mile. So from a new source perspective, when we cite a new water supply well, one of the things DEP always has us do is a mass balance calculation. So we'll look at worst case scenario, like 180 days with no recharge to the aquifer. How far out is this well going to draw water? And then calculate, so we're pumping, say, 1 million gallons a day. There has to be more recharge to the aquifer in a day, on average, than what we're taking out, or, you know, DEP will flag that as something to be addressed. So we always look at that mass balance calculation.
Could you speak to golf courses? I'll be honest,
I haven't worked a lot with golf courses, so in terms of how much they use and how they're regulated,
I don't know either on the golf course side.
They have a water withdrawal permit from the DEP.
Okay, so they're considered a small operator. So they were, so if they have so it was just referred to me was they have to have a licensed operator on staff because they are withdrawing X amount of gallons out of the aquifer as well.
and they're permitted. I do. Yeah,
Permitted.
correct.
Thank you.
So, can I ask a question? I'm a little concerned, I don't understand something here. You talked about first of all, 400 homes that are seasonal. Is that on the system? What about the people who have their own wells? Are they counted in that 400?
Thank you. I was talking about the ones that are not.
Exactly. I think that we have to make clear that if it's 400 on, we got another 800 off. And now you're, I mean, you know, easily. So now you're talking about a totally different situation. I think this is some of what people are saying here. You have, at this point, as we see it, not yet done the necessary work to ensure that this is adequate in the way of a master plan. The second thing I would like to say and ask is, you talk about the fact that this capital for this is going to be borne by the people who are getting the service, but you're talking about expanding the service. Now, if you take a new line, just say from Clark Road to Cedarville, does that mean everybody on that road is now going to have to hook up to the central system and pay for it, even though they have adequate things right now? Because what you're doing is saying we'll be so much better off with a public system than we will by private wells, which is questionable in a rural area such as that, where you have worked it so that you have larger lot lines and things like that, so that they can cope with it through individual wells. Now all of a sudden, are you saying that you'll run a line down there and they're going to have to hook up and pay for it?
Yeah, no, we're not saying that at all. You know, and again, the plan is for additional water supplies for redundancy and resiliency to meet firm capacity. We're not looking to expand the water system and increase withdrawal. If we do that, we have to go back to DEP and revise our permit. Again, I mentioned earlier, our Water Management Act permit regulates how much water we can pull out of the ground. So when we added Forges Field, that was a redundant water supply. The next well will also be more of a safeguard, an additional redundant supply. We're not doing that for system expansion.
But you are talking about interconnecting them, right?
Interconnecting pressure zones. They're transmission lines. They're not meant for new connections or development. I apologize if that wasn't clear, but yeah, that interconnect is to move water freely between the system. It's not to, you know, require connections, or it's not meant to increase withdrawal.
Good evening. My name is John Joseph. I live on Kathleen Drive in Manomet. And I think as Director of Public Works, you've done a good job with what you've had to work with. I think what I'm sensing, and I want to bring some of my concerns in as well, you're dealing here so far with what I call a capital plan on how the water supply system will be balanced and expanded. And as such, you're dealing with only one of three elements. There is the element of conservation, and that hasn't been addressed. There's also the element of water quality, and neither has that been addressed. So out of the three, we're hearing an awful lot about one element. Now let me elaborate a bit on the water, and part of that is due to the organization of our town government. We have a conservation committee, but unfortunately it's not part of a department. We do have a Department of Environmental Protection, which is obviously reporting to the town manager. The gentleman already spoke to water conservation. Just as an example, right now there are 4,000 bedrooms permitted and being built in Plymouth, counting the rental units as well as sole ownership. I mean, these are nails being driven into wood right now. And that's going to have an effect, and it's going to continue to grow. I'm here, what I'd like to emphasize is the water quality. Many of you on the board know that there is we call it a 40B, but in fact it's a high density development going in at the end of Kathleen Drive, and it will have an unmanned 66,000 gallon per day wastewater treatment plant. The town engineer approved a plan in which there's one limit switch. If that switch fails, that human waste will be spewing out onto town property in an aquifer protection area. So there's issues of water quality here that if that's the kind of oversight we have in terms of these unmanned wastewater treatment plants, and I've noticed, for example, that you now rate the Briggs property poor because of that. Yet at one time, the Briggs property, it was rated as being the highest because it had the highest quality, best producing, to the point that plans were made for a 10-inch water line to go from that site out to the line on State Road. So here we've made a decision already to avoid using the best source of water in Manomet in favor of this unmanned wastewater treatment plant. And that's just one example. So consequently, I think before many of us are satisfied with a water master plan, the other two elements has to be added to it, and that really goes beyond your authority or responsibility, JB. You've got to take it up to the town manager. I mean, you know, the water, environmental protection issues, and also the conservation issues. Maybe I'm incorrect, but that's my view right now. Thank you.
I just have a question. Again, this is the open dialogue piece. The unmanned wastewater, are you referring to the sawmill plant that's going to be constructed?
Yes.
So again, a wastewater treatment plant is permitted and regulated by the DEP. So they're required to operate that plant, have a maintenance agreement, have generators, do visual inspections. So nobody really, I don't think it's a station that requires 24/7 operation.
Right,
Um,
it does
it's
not.
just- it's just a
It's
question-
unmanned. It
Right.
takes a Class C operator.
That's correct. So I mean, people will be there, and they have to, again, adhere to that permit that's stipulated by the Mass DEP,
They'll only be
not the
here
town.
there occasionally for maintenance purposes. But my point is, the plan for that protection system to work was approved by town engineering, and there's one $50 limit switch, a high limit switch. If that fails, all that waste is going to spew out, and because that plant does not, and this is not the place to get into the details.
No, but it's important because you bring
It's a
up.
little bit like the Teflon O-ring on the space shuttle.
But I just don't want to have anybody nervous because, or concerned with the station, because the town did look at it, but again, the state approves that wastewater treatment plant, not the town.
No, I know.
Okay?
Well, they approved it, but the plan for the plant was approved by the town engineer.
Sure.
They
And,
approved the plan.
yep, and the reason why the town didn't pursue with Briggs is because, again, it would have been directly adjacent to a wastewater treatment facility, and that was an uncomfortable position for us to be in. But I do really want to talk about water quality, because Plymouth has some really great water quality. We pull a good amount of water out of the ground, and generally, we don't have to treat it. We have little iron and manganese issues, but it's really great water. And, you know, when you talk about water quality, I don't have concerns, and I know this table doesn't have concerns with your water quality at this point, because we comply with this, what's called the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal mandate for us to basically meet a number of requirements in terms of what's in your water. Every year, your water department publishes a brochure in terms of what we test for and what we actually find. And you can go online and see all of this. And then the state is there right behind the Safe Drinking Water Act, basically, you know, making sure that these towns are in full compliance. And then, Ryan, I don't know if you want to talk about what we did in the master plan?
Yeah, so the Chapter 3 talks about water quality, and like, as JB mentioned, the Water Division's done a great job maintaining compliance with the Safe Water Drinking Act, and DEP has a regimented schedule that they have to follow and test for certain contaminants, and they all have to be reported to the state. And as JB mentioned, in your consumer confidence report that you get each year, they're responsible to provide to you anything that they had tested for. Back in the summer, while we were in the middle of writing the master plan, we started to identify some water quality items as we were doing the full review of some iron and manganese, and the potential ability to help increase the flexibility of what's called sequestering the iron and manganese, which I don't want to get too technical, but it's a way to sort of keep the iron and manganese in solution so it doesn't show up as brown in your water. So the Water Division proactively went, and we're in the process now of actually doing a separate water quality study on about 3 of the well supplies in town to help better make those run more efficiently. In addition to that, I'm sure everyone has seen the news recently about the emerging contaminants out there, about PFAS and everything. And and that's now coming out almost with a maximum contaminant level very, very soon in the state of Massachusetts. We recommended in the capital plan what's called a PFAS preparedness study, which would involve looking for land uses and other areas and potential for contamination. So, including the potential to even look at, if it does come back as having anything that's even close to being positive or near the limit, a treatability study that can show you exactly what would it take to remove that contaminant from that source if it ever became a critical issue. So, just to let you know that we are staying in front of the water quality issue.
Harvey Lucerne. I've been on the Plymouth water system for 47 years, and I have no problems with it. One of the questions that I would like to have discussed is the Plymouth stand on the proposed DEP regulations on the forever chemicals, PFASs. And there is a public hearing at Lakeville on January 28th at 10 a.m. And I urge you all to be there to discuss your views on the new regulations, because they aren't in effect yet. But the regulations will go down to 20 parts per trillion. And I think presently they're around 70, are they, from Massachusetts? On an honor basis or something. They're not too stringent on them. And there's the Globe wrote an article on 11/22/19 on dark waters. Urge everyone to see it. And Massachusetts, the standards were issued on 2/13/2019. There's an article in the Globe on that. And the contaminants are just the tip of the iceberg. But in Massachusetts, the towns and cities that submitted their data to the state, 28 of the 37 mass municipal water systems have provided test results to the state of DEP. And of those, 12 were found that the amounts exceeded the proposed standards for drinking water. The town of Easton has, I think, 8 wells. 7 of the 8 wells are contaminated with PFAS, way above the state level. Now, Vermont has 20 parts per trillion. New Hampshire has 11 parts per trillion. And if money was not a problem, I'd say let's have 0 parts per trillion, but the proposed regulations are great starting points. Now, Globe also reported on the fertilizer comes from a sludge operation on Deer Island, 18,000 parts per trillion of PFAS in that fertilizer, and it's used all over the United States. It's shipped by rail car where it's processed with another fertilizer company, so I wouldn't recommend using that fertilizer anymore. Now, what I'd like to know is what are the town of Plymouth's proposed regulations on PFASs? And the map on the DEP website showed that there were 10 or 11 wells that were tested. According to their map, I think there were 10, and the map was updated 12/3/2019. And I'm wondering what and where are those results so that we could look at them to see. And those are my first question is, what and where, or what are the stands of the town of Plymouth? Are we going to go along with the 20 parts per trillion, et cetera? Thank you.
Good point, Harvey, and you know, I've known you for a little bit now, and you're always spot on with your comments. So PFAS is definitely an emerging issue, you know, throughout the country. I will say that we've been, you know, in contact with DEP. I have been in touch with the manager's office. We are definitely taking a proactive approach with PFAS. We have not tested any of our wells for PFAS, so I don't know where that 12/3 date is coming from, Harvey. So that the town of Plymouth has not done any PFAS testing. I will tell you that the manager, myself, and staff will be at that meeting on the 28th. And again, is at the Southeast Region of DEP. Thank you. And we will be there. Again, this is a new issue, and I'm sure you've all read about it or heard about it in the news. It's firefighting foam, it's Scotch Guard, it's septic systems. We think that the Easton issue is coming from septic systems. They're not sure. And what happens is this chemical and its fluorocarbons, there's really 6 of them that we're testing for, or we need to test for. They sit in the groundwater and they move in the groundwater, and what's happening is medically, people are ingesting them, it's getting into your body, and what we're hearing in the research and the presentations that have been made to us is that your liver filters the PFAS and it's sitting in there. So that's really what happens. there really hasn't been any significant change, you know, in testing for water for quite some time. So this is really a big change for us. So after the 28th, you know, we're going to make a decision. I can tell you right now, again, we want to be proactive and know what's happening in your water system as soon as possible to manage that the best way we can. And what's happening is these systems that do experience PFAS, they can treat it with carbon and, what's the other one, Ryan?
Like an ion exchange resin or reverse osmosis. If
Right,
it's
so,
really
so
expensive, yeah.
it can be treated, but it's very expensive. And, you know, we're looking to apply, the state is coming forward with grant money for the testing, so we'll be engaging in that. And I do expect at the time we'll move forward with the testing sometime after the 28th. We've already secured pricing to do that. But again, it's something new. I will tell you that I believe New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire have implemented that 20 part per trillion threshold. DEP has not officially come out with an MCL for it. That's really what we want to discuss. We want to understand if we test now, we don't have to test again. We just want to make sure we're on page with the state before we move forward and do anything. But again, we have your best interests in mind when we do that testing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ryan, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I know
Yeah,
EP does a lot
sure.
with PFAS. It is changing by the day, by the week.
Right,
And I know the DEP's on it.
Literally, there's alerts sent out every day almost from DEP about this or that. We've worked with multiple clients, from ones that have had to do public notification over a certain limit. We're working on some communities like Easton and Hyannis is another one that we're actually putting treatment systems in as we speak. And that's kind of why we recommended that that Plymouth proceed with the PFAS preparedness study, just to get ahead of the curve as far as identifying what potentially would have to happen if one of the wells were to come across as having high levels. What would they do for treatment? What are the land uses around there? What room do you have to actually put in a facility to treat that water? And this kind of stems into the next topic a little bit, but it kind of is around the same thing about protecting the wells and getting into zoning and aquifer protection. And it's hand in hand, and that's part of the reason why we also, because of these emerging contaminants, it seems like every 5 years there's something else, another contaminant. A couple of years ago it was 1,4-dioxane, then it was perchlorate, and there's other things that keep coming up. And we did Emery and I worked with another client about 7 years ago to do a very detailed hydrogeologic analysis on each well and understand exactly where, when that well pumps, where exactly is that water coming from on a daily basis? How far out does that well draw water? Meaning that would be the land use that you'd want to protect the most, right? For any recharge that would go into that aquifer in that area. So the modeling software we have is so sophisticated now that we can actually put in the actual withdrawal from the well on an average or daily basis and identify what's called like a capture zone of what can be withdrawn from that well on a daily basis, or even over in the summer or even just today, like in January. So there's another layer of zoning that potentially could move forward of identifying that and adopting a more stringent interior zone to what's more around the well. I think, as you know, DEP requires towns and public water suppliers to own and control the zone 1 of the well, which is about a 400-foot radius around each well. So we would be talking, in addition to that, well, expanding that zoning to be a little more stringent to protect the wells from any future contaminants, from any potential future land uses. And that would tie in with the town's existing aquifer protection bylaw that they have. So that's something else that was recommended in the master plan, to be proactive.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, again, the master plan it's laying the foundation, the framework to utilize these type of options. And, you know, when and if the time, you know, allows for, we can make that decision.
This is a quickie, so it might not be worth. Just wondering if there's any testing for pharmaceuticals, which are so widespread.
So the EPA, and this is how PFAS sort of came up. So the EPA, I'm not sure if it's every year, Pete, or if it's every other year or so, but they call it the unregulated contaminant rule, and they essentially require public water suppliers. They pick people sometimes at random. They have a program that goes sequentially, and they pick a broad range of random chemicals, and they pick water suppliers across the country, and they send out the bottles, and you got to fill it out and send it back. And this is how some of these things get caught. And once they get some back that come in at some elevated levels that may raise an eyebrow, they then do a little more further detail. So that's how these emerging contaminants come up. You know, 15, 20 years ago, it was all we really knew about was nitrates. and nitrates from wastewater. But what's really behind nitrates is that's just a precursor of what's in nitrates. If we really feel that septic system effluent, then within those nitrates, we're getting 1,4-dioxane, we're getting the PFAS components, we're getting pharmaceuticals, anything essentially flushed down the toilet or your sink. Medicines, anything of that, toilet bowl cleaner, anything that can go back into the aquifer is essentially what they can trace now. And it's mostly related to how fine-tuned we can get with our laboratory testing. Now we're testing down to parts per trillion for PFAS, which is pretty amazing. So that's where we're finding these chemicals, is because we're able to test down to this minutia of level detail. And just so you know, 1 part per trillion is like a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that's what they can detect right now for something that's in the water.
And I don't know, I don't want to put Peter on the spot, but I mean, the testing on the regulatory side is tremendous in terms of what the town does now to monitor your drinking water to make sure we're in compliance. I mean, that's something we do every day, 7 days a week.
Yeah, the town takes over 100 samples, just for bacteria on a monthly basis, but the UCMR4, the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, the EPA and the DEP have a lot of rules, and this is a very stringent one. Like Ryan said, this is where they discover these chemicals, and what they want to do is find out if they're present in your water, if there is any benefit from them regulating these chemicals, and just how much of a burden it would be on the communities to put in a system to filter these out, or whatever is necessary to remove them. Plymouth does participate in the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. That comes out every 3 years. And there's usually about 25 different contaminants that they test for. But in addition to that, and all the bacteria sampling, we have also a very stringent quarterly, we call it a quarterly sampling schedule. They give us a schedule, it's 3 years at a whack, and it tells us when we're going to sample for volatile organic compounds, inorganic compounds, when we're going to sample for nitrates, nitrites, secondary contaminants, which aren't regulated, but they do have their recommended levels. The amount of, the water quality in Plymouth is good, and it's backed up by the amount of sampling that we do and the results of those samples. And you can usually get the results from those in the consumer conference report. And of course, if you're looking for a specific contaminant and what level it might or might not be present in your water, you can always call me. My number's on the website.
However, how does this all impact private wells, I wonder, that are not on the water supply? How can we test for these things? What can we assume about our wells, if anything?
Right, and I was speaking to the Board of Health director today, and, the Board of Health, permits wells today, and they require testing upon installation and then upon sale in accordance with Title V. So I think that's just, the responsibility of the homeowner. I mean, I know I have a well, and I test it every couple of years. I think that's just something that you should be doing, and just be aware of, what you're drinking, especially if you're on a septic system too, or your neighbor's septic system, and how they maintain it, or if they don't maintain it. Those are questions you need to ask yourself.
Yeah, and a fairly inexpensive test is testing for nitrates. And I'm not saying that that's, if you have 0 nitrates, you could have something else in the water, but it's a good indication that nitrates are kind of some level of septic system influent, or maybe fertilizer, leachate fertilizer, things like that. So it's a good indication that there could be something else there that nitrates are sort of hiding, if you will. Yeah.
All right, I think Ryan hit question 2. This is the zoning one. Anybody have questions on the zoning piece in terms of, changing or modifying anything in terms of a chemical or use? Nope? Okay. Question 3. Recommend the most convenient locations for public water refill stations in your plan. So the goal of the master plan is to address the plan for the future of the water system operations to meet demand and have sufficient redundancy and resiliency. Locations for public water refill stations is not part of the current water system master plan scope or water system operations. So this question really asks, can we provide, potable public water supplies, randomly through the town? So for us, that would be problematic. Not only is it wasn't addressed in the water master plan, but it's not metered. The other thing too is licensed operators were required from the source to the last spigot. So, you know, it could become a health and safety issue. We don't know who could tamper with it. So those open fill stations are problematic in a number of ways as well. Yes?
Hi, Melanie Monaco, Precinct 7. So if we cannot give our visitors clean, safe, public drinking water downtown, how do they get water? They have to bring plastic water bottles? They can't refill a water bottle. So to me, it should be part of the plan. That was my question. That was one of my questions. So how do they get water? If we're going to be looking at banning single-use plastic, how do they get water? We have lots of visitors. We have lots of tourists.
It's good to put a face with a name, Melanie. So, yeah, I think that's a little bit different than a refill station. I know in the past I've had a lot of conversations with not residents in Plymouth, but in other towns about ice stations, you know, and things of that nature. But a drinking water fountain, I think, might be a little bit different in the downtown. But again, we still have the same concerns with cross connections and, you know, health and safety and things of that. But Ryan, anybody aware of fountains, drinking water fountains in downtowns that the public water supply provides? Something we'd have to look at. I'm not aware of any. But as far as just like an open dispensary for people to fill their water, that's what I assume this question was.
No, this is talking about water fountains.
What about the public station in the town hall?
Yeah, I
And
think
the
so.
public comfort station down on the water? Do they have drinking fountains?
There's drinking fountains in Town Hall?
Mhm.
There's 2 on every floor. Right. Inside.
Are there any in the comfort station?
In the comfort station. In the bathroom. I think outside the bathroom there is a drinking water fountain. I think you're right, Harvey.
We're talking bubblers here.
Bubblers.
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 Okay, just clear.
So question 4. The report should expand on the fundamental issue underlying all the infrastructure, and especially the condition and health of the Plymouth Carver aquifer on which all of our wells, private and public, and water supplies depend. One of the recommendations/capital projects in the master plan is to delineate a groundwater protection district to maintain the health of the aquifer. Ryan, Anne Marie, I don't know if you want to add anything to that in terms of, I know there's been a lot of talk about, you know, the private and public wells and the impact on the aquifer, but again, you know, when we do future capital projects, especially when we're looking at a new water supply, you know, that analysis will be done on the water supply, the aquifer, and those wells will be looked at.
Yeah, I think just speaking from when we withdraw the water, you know, I think we tried to explain that there's a very rigorous water quality checks and testing that goes on, and we're trying to propose studies that would make sure we're staying in the forefront. And from the protection of what's going back in the ground, that's why we sort of recommended the the more extensive aquifer protection district and some modeling to try to do another layer of protection to make sure that we protect the water that's going back into the ground before it's being pumped again. Yeah.
The other thing I hear a lot of is the Plymouth Carver aquifer from outside agencies, the state. I mean, it is one of the largest aquifers around. I think it's one of the largest aquifers in New England.
It is the largest in the state.
In the state, and is it 10 billion gallons? I've heard numbers of high of 10 billion gallons. I mean, so it's a large aquifer that provides a tremendous amount of water, and we sit right over that.
Yeah, and I think when we do look at a new source and whatnot, we do always look at what's the impact to the aquifer and what's the impact to the nearby environmental receptors. And we always do like a mass balance check, but again, it's the biggest aquifer in the state, so we have a lot of water. We just want to make sure where we take the water out is respects the environment and the ponds and the wildlife that's around. So.
I can't get over going backwards with this clicker. So question 5, I think we addressed with global warming and sea level rise. Any other questions on this regarding infrastructure, water?
Question 4.
Question 4? You could have came up to this one. You needed to get up anyways, Walter.
I agree. Walter Morrison, Bloody Pond, and that would be in South Plymouth. In the question, what I've been hearing about is water withdrawal. Part of water withdrawal going along with it is water going back in. And so I haven't heard too much being said about how that is influencing the plans, how it overall impacts everything. From work that I had to do at White Island Pond, I've studied USGA maps, at least as they pertain to South Plymouth. We talk about it being a sole water aquifer, but yet it bleeds out, essentially, at many different points and through many different, we'll call it river systems. When you look in South Plymouth around White Island Pond, there was two essentially parallel going out in side by side. One being in the Red Brook and the other one going out through White Island Pond, and then it went out through Century Bogs and then down, essentially down a different system and came out at a different point into Buzzards Bay. But when you look at Plymouth, it's going out in all different directions. Bloody Pond, for instance, the water in that area essentially starts across the highway at Hathaway Pond, goes through Bloody Pond, goes through Black Pond, goes into Little Herring and then Great Herring Pond, and then eventually out into the canal. So by way of example, you're seeing all these different places where water is exiting naturally. But then on water that we're withdrawing, to the best of my knowledge, it's only exiting in 2 places that we've already drawn out through our septic, through our system. And that would be the pipe going out into Cape Cod Bay and then out through the recharge plant, which is behind us, or down in Camelot Park. So the question is there any thought in the future as you're withdrawing water from these other areas in town, does the recharge of some of that water that's being used go back to some of these other areas? And has this been looked at all? And going back to our previous question on cranberry growers that have wells, they absolutely have to have a permit for it also.
So there's a lot of pieces to that one too. Again, we focused a lot on withdrawal. I think the infiltration and the recharge is another really good point. And I will say the town looks at that when we review projects in terms of maximizing both those, how do we infiltrate runoff and, how do we recharge at the aquifer to the best of our ability. I mean, that's definitely a priority when we review these projects. But as far as, the site screening, the desktop study that, that Anne Marie and Ryan mentioned, when we look at these new, supplies, future water supplies, we definitely have an eye towards those locations closer to the system in terms of economics, easy to connect, close by, when you look at infrastructure costs in terms of piping, there's concerns related with that. So the closer the existing system, the better. The other thing too is the further away from the system, you look at topography, you look at having storage problems and elevation issues in terms of pressure. So all those things come into play. But to answer your question, Walter, I don't know, Anne Marie, if you want to take that one in terms of that site screening, the desktop piece. I mean, again, we have slides on this, and again, this whole presentation will be online if you want to look at that. But in terms of, how, when we look at these sites, the benefit of reuse, because you brought up a great stat in terms of the infiltration given the square mile in terms of adding a well.
I do want to add that, so the Plymouth Carver aquifer is 500 billion gallon aquifer. And I know that the town has historically also looked at alternative uses for wastewater. I know that historically they looked at it for irrigation, for golf courses, to get it to recharge. And I think they keep these options open. They've got to be economically viable. And when we do modeling, say, for a new source, in some towns, we'll take into account recharge to the aquifer from septic systems if that becomes a significant factor in the mass balance. But in the case of Plymouth, we have such a big aquifer and so much recharge that that's not usually needed, it's not needed to justify the withdrawals, because we have so much more recharge than what we're taking out. But that would just be an added bonus if we took into account what's going back into the aquifer from septic systems, because once you get outside the downtown areas, there's a lot of septic recharge.
Any other questions on 4? Five, so we talked about 5. And so those are the questions we did receive, through the website and the email.
I could ask a question about one you just...
Sure, which one? If I can use this clicker right. There you go.
It was Melanie's question.
Okay, the dispensers? Sure.
I know that we're talking about a 30-year plan, and we're looking to the future, but I want to just bring us back a little bit to this year, where we anticipate that we're going to have wonderful celebrations. And as Melanie said, that we're going to have a lot of people here. And I'm not quite sure if we answered the question about where they're going to get the water. And let me just couple it with something else. The Board of Health has been looking for the last year at polystyrene. And as you know, PFAS is a product of polystyrene. So as you continue to use your clamshells and your takeout containers and your water bottles, you're contributing to the polystyrene load in this town and PFAS over time. So what I'm saying is, if we're going to think about our celebrations and people buying their water out of plastic bottles when they're on the waterfront, we're continuing to contribute to this problem that we're talking about today, these emerging forever chemicals. So I know I'm putting a lot of dots together, but I still want to hear an answer to Melanie's question, because from the perspective of the Board of Health, we'd like to know where people who care about not using plastic, they're very conscientious about it, very conscientious, where will they be able to actually fill their water bottles? Walk over to Town Hall, and perhaps next to the restroom there's a water station, but we don't even know if it's there. We know Town Hall will be closed during a lot of these occasions where they actually do have water fills. So I would just like to think through that before a 100-degree day where we might be celebrating on the waterfront and people don't know where to get water and they don't want to buy it in a plastic bottle. If somebody has an answer for that, maybe you have an answer for that, would be great.
Well, I think mobile water stations are a great idea.
So
Portable water stations that can be moved to areas on the waterfront or during
it sounds like a
parade.
wonderful idea, but I don't know if we've planned for that. And I heard you saying that it might be a health issue, but I haven't heard you say why, or maybe we weren't talking about the same thing. So anyway, I'm just bringing it up because I think it's this year's issue and this summer's issue, particularly if it's a warm summer. I don't know what the manual says it will be. Thank you, JB.
Yeah, no, I understand the point, and I do think it has validity, and I think that, it's something we need to look at, and that's the whole purpose of the meeting this evening, is to kind of take some of the feedback and really examine it a little bit. There are going to be a lot of people in Plymouth this year. And I know the 400th has a number of events, and I know they'll have beverages and water available for purchase. But, I like to relate things to my own world. I know when I go to the gym now, they have all the dispensaries where you use your own water bottle and fill it, and so I get that. For me, though, at DPW, it's a maintenance issue. If we provide these bubblers, how do we maintain them and how do we keep them clean? That's my first question. You know what I mean? So I think it's a cooperative thing. I think it would be more of a policy decision of the town if we're going to put bubblers in the downtown. And if so, how do we maintain those and keep them safe? Yeah, and as Ryan mentioned, it's a weather issue. Dirt, cold, freezing, we have to shut them off, so they wouldn't be available and accessible all year long during the summer. And then once you have the heat, people getting sick from drinking from them, so we'd have to look at that. But we're happy to have that discussion and report back.
But I would think Plymouth could be a leader and figure out a way to do it, particularly before we have the 100th celebration. Maybe we can even make some money off it. 400 logo on a little metal bottle that people can go around and refill. I mean, I just think there's.
Point taken. Sure. Again, if we could make it happen, it'd be location, how many, what's the cost? I mean, all of these things would have to be, discussed. And I'm assuming when we eventually get back in front of the select board, that's something we'll have to consider.
John, I think you should put a portable pack on and go around the waterfront and dispense.
That'd be a lot easier. And I'd be happy to do it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please use the microphone.
Okay. So I get the sense that the Water Master Plan was created in order to accommodate future growth in Plymouth. And I think some of our frustrations and some of what's being said tonight is we would really like to see a Water Master Plan that was really addressing protecting our aquifer in Plymouth. And I know you're trying to balance those two things. How do we accommodate the rapid growth in Plymouth by protecting our aquifer? But if we start taking into consideration some of the things, some of the people who've asked questions tonight, the quality of the water, the availability of water, the ways in which we can protect our water from getting more contaminants in it, it's a much bigger vision of a plan. And it may be out of your purview to do this. But that's what we really want. We really want a water master plan that's talking about not just accommodating growth ad infinitum. In fact, one of the things that has not come up is there ever going to be a point at which Plymouth is going to be able to say, in order to protect our aquifer and our current residents in this town, are we going to have to put a moratorium on growth until we've answered sufficiently a lot of those questions?
Yep, no, I agree. I think a lot of us agree in the room. And what I can say is I think we may want to expand the dialogue in the master plan because, again, we want a resilient system, one that can sustain, Plymouth well into the foreseeable future. And it is important. You look at what's happening across the country, especially in California, with drought management and their inability to provide drinking water. And, we definitely don't want to be at that point. But again, I will say the master plan in Plymouth does a really good job at conservation. It's just a question of meeting and balancing that. And Ryan, I don't know if we can look at that or revisit that, but we can have that discussion internally.
Yeah, just to reiterate, we provided the information before about the groundwater protection district and the additional modeling, which has to do with aquifer protection. So that was discussed in the master plan and as made as a recommendation.
Yeah, please use, if you want to get in line in the microphone, probably the most efficient use of time.
I'd first of all like to thank you. I think it's great that we're addressing the issues, and this is really worthwhile. You received a letter from Six Ponds. I'm Pompey Delafield, the president of Six Ponds, Six Ponds Improvement Association, if I didn't properly introduce myself before. And we've written you a letter. There's a great deal in that letter. I won't read it now because almost every issue in one format or another you have addressed. But I think that they are still concerned, and they are concerns that maybe this doesn't go far enough. And I think that Judy in particular, who just spoke on the fact that the last one is, should we be considering a moratorium? The town is growing very, very fast. This is critical that we have a master plan that is more comprehensive than this one, that will guide us as to how much we can increase the size and population of the town, and under what basis and how that will work. And I think that was sort of the last of the letter that we sent you, was we need to consider what steps we take to ensure that we keep ahead of the pollution and the problems that we have and all the things that were brought up tonight. And I think we need more public input over a period of time before anything is adopted. So thank you very much again. We appreciate the effort you have put in. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm gonna ask Marlene McCollum, the Assistant Town Manager, to speak to the moratorium in 1 second, but you got ahead of me there. So we have, in addition to the questions, we did receive several letters from Six Ponds, from Savory Pond Conservancy, from Evelyn Strawn, Judy Barber, and a lot of those questions I think we discussed in some pretty good detail this evening. So, and again, we will put these questions kind of in a written format, and again, this will all be online for everybody to see, and we'll get these on the town's website. So with that, I just want to ask Marlene to address that moratorium question, please.
Thank you. Moratoriums are a very important, powerful local tool that is certainly at Plymouth's disposal. They're adopted by town meeting, and they can be adopted as general or as zoning moratorium. They're not unlimited though in how you can use them, and town meeting can choose to enact a moratorium for 1 year, and it can be extended for a second year on a subsequent vote of town meeting. However, they cannot be unlimited. So it's a 2-year maximum, essentially, timeout, and it gives the town an ability to plan and implement recommendations to address the issues that you're facing, whether it's water, whether it's traffic and curb cut moratorium, whether it's a zoning moratorium on actual property rights that people have vested. So they are not a blank check to stop development indefinitely. And with the water, specifically to a utility water hookup moratorium, it would only apply to those properties that front on water mains. And as you look at development, one of the things that town meeting would certainly want to debate is, would such a tool essentially drive additional sprawl to happen in areas where we don't have infrastructure? So what a utility hookup moratorium would do would be to prevent for that year or two development within the system, but it would not be able to prevent development on land that is not served by the water system. So there could be some fairly serious unintended consequences to these types of decisions. But that's certainly a debate very much worth having at town meeting or at the water commissioners. But keep in mind that the moratorium has to be lifted at some point, and at that point where the moratorium is lifted, it would be incumbent on us as the community to have addressed those issues and come to a resolution on how we would move forward once the moratorium's lifted to allow that development to then happen. We can't take people's property rights. The other unintended consequence that sometimes happens when you talk about moratorium is that because it does have to be enacted, only town meeting can do it. So there's a long process where there's discussion, there's hearings, there's a long time before you actually get to town meeting where all of this is vetted. And what other communities who have done moratorium has seen sometimes is that there's a rush to get your permits in hand before town meeting. So sometimes you can end up with less than thoughtfully designed projects because they're rushing to get hooked into the system before a moratorium is enacted. But Plymouth has done them before. Plymouth has done the sewer moratorium, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And a lot of development that we now have in the sewer service area was developed during that period of where the moratorium was in place, and some of that development has septic systems that now we're trying to move onto the sewer system. So I guess the point of my long-winded answer is that it's a valuable tool. It certainly has its role to play, but it can be, there can be a lot of moving pieces with it, and it's something that if the town decides to enact it, should be enacted very carefully. Thanks.
Thank you, Marlene, very much. Another question?
You know, I hope on my return up here, you'll see me as persistent rather than argumentative. But,
We like persistence.
There are two things I'd like to sort of comment back on. One, you've made the statement now a couple of times that you think we're doing a good job on conservation. I have to assume from that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you're hanging your hat on the 65 gallons per capita per day that's specified as the new standard in last year's permit amendment for the Forges Field well addition. My view of that is maybe we got lucky getting there. We certainly can't isolate any proactive measures that we took with quantifiable contributions to the mix of resources we use in town for water supply, which means if we can't really isolate those and we can't pull levers like that to reduce usage when we need to, there's an equal number of factors that could actually move it back up again, some of which have come out tonight. So I still, if you believe that we're already there on conservation because we're at this standard the state has set, then I assume that there's no place for a conservation planning effort such as I've proposed, and you can respond to that. The other thing I want to say is that, we talked about how fortunate we are to have an aquifer that's got that kind of water in it. I have to say from a personal level, the reason I love Plymouth, and I've lived here 25 plus years in two different parts of town, is that it's a community defined by water. I mean, salt water and fresh water. It's what makes Plymouth what it is. And what we do with water goes a long way toward defining who we are as townspeople in Plymouth. I don't believe there's no impact associated with just taking more water out of the aquifer. There are impacts. There's habitat loss. There's economic costs to the system. There's probably going to be spillover economic effects on taxpayers. It's certainly, to me, the right thing to do is to use as little of this precious resource as we possibly can. And to basically, deny that we should be doing more, I think is reneging on our responsibility. And so I invite you to say, if you think we're there now on conservation, then I'll go away. I'll be curious to see if the DEP feels that way the next time we go back in for a permit amendment, even if it's a redundant well you're adding, because they now have some leverage in the rules here. So I saw that out. I've probably spoken enough, but I'm not satisfied with any of this.
Sure, well, let me try and do a better job with an answer then, Eric. So it is, your water is definitely a precious resource, and we need to do everything and anything possible to make sure we're managing that in a healthy and productive way. Instead of saying, I think, we are meeting the standards put forth by DEP in terms of water conservation. And the Plymouth Water Division does a really good job at that, and I think we've made some really great strides. I know we've made some really good strides over the past 10 years to meet those. Can we improve those? Are we willing to engage in that process and discussion? Absolutely. I will say, though, as your DPW director, I'm tasked to wear multiple hats. Setting rates in the spring to fund infrastructure to make sure we can, cover those capital costs without tremendously increasing rates. That is a process that we take very seriously, and, we manage that every day, with the water division in terms of revenues and billing and making sure projects are done on time and under budget. That's a whole piece of it. And I remember, when we first started talking with the DEP with our permit, I think we were permitted 6.2 MGD, a little over 6 maybe. We're down to 4.3. So I was, jumping up and down at the DEP office saying, hey, we can't afford to have such a tremendous reduction in our permit. So and we'll post this information. I know it's really good information of what our reduction was with withdrawal. And the state did that to everybody in the Commonwealth. So we saw almost a 2 MGD drop, as an average withdrawal. So that's significant in terms of water conservation. So to answer your question, as quickly and as efficiently as I can, is we'll look at it and we're happy to work with you. I mean, we're not here to challenge or to argue. We want to provide the biggest benefit to the town to make sure that we have the water, like I said, well into the foreseeable future. And anything we can do to make that happen, I think we will do. But again, we have to strike that perfect balance between revenue and consumption and infrastructure and conservation, and we do a good job at that. Right?
Just to add to Mr. Cody, because I appreciate his feedback. I think the water conservation topic for the Water Division, from what we've seen in the past, is a fairly new topic. I know they've gone back and done different programs, but specifically, you can see in the master plan that the residential per capita really has dropped over the last 3 years, and it was no coincidence that it happened back when the emergency declaration happened in 2016 with the mandatory water ban. And last year, for the first time, when they implemented the water use restrictions for outside watering, we did see a drop in the May and June timeframe from the typical average use for that month. In addition to that, replacing all their meters and adding that fourth block rate structure to encourage water conservation. These are all things that are on Mass DEP's checklist for helping increase water conservation awareness, typically surrounding the price of someone's water. Obviously, the return you get when you get your water bill helps to conserve water, but also moving towards, and this year will be the first year that there's the mandatory outside water use restriction for 2 days a week, which you'll see starting on May 1st. So I guess to answer your question, Mr. Cody, it is something that's in the process, and I think because the data was so raw and not from the meter changeout program and from the fourth water conservation program, if you actually look at some of the water use data that comes out for 2019, because our report is from 2018 prior, I think you may see that water use is dropping even further from some of the work that they did over the last 2 years.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, Melanie?
I think a couple times it was mentioned that recommendations on how to protect our aquifer were addressed in the plan. And I think they may have been touched on briefly, but I didn't see that actually addressed. Details, specifics, how far out, what to be restricting, what chemicals shouldn't be used around the vicinity, the specifics of protecting our aquifers. I've heard, I think twice, that it was addressed. So I'm just asking, where was it addressed so that the public can actually see it?
It was addressed by recommendation to move forward. That's a fairly extensive study to be involved with. So it's a study to be done to look at, identify those capture zones, and then obviously, with amending any zoning bylaw and zoning map, there's an entire town meeting process associated with that. So it takes time.
Yes, Evelyn?
Evelyn Strawn. I have to say that I'm somewhat surprised by the discussion this evening, and it may be a reflection that there are so few ratepayers here, that we're in the minority, that there hasn't been any focus on the capital costs associated with this. But that's just a comment. And a concern as someone who's going to have to pay for it. But I also wanted to sort of support what Mr. Cody was saying, that I think there's a lot of energy in this room and a lot of energy and people concerned beyond those who came this evening, and it might be a good opportunity to enlist some volunteer assistance in looking at some of the conservation issues. I'd also like to say that, and since I've got the microphone, that a lot of the things we're talking about, I think, addresses the need that the town has for a new master plan, that we're like looking to the water master plan to answer questions that are beyond the scope of that. And I think that
That's a cost, it's a capital cost that town meeting would have to approve, but I think it's something that there's time and that we should all get behind it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to affirm what Evelyn said and what Eric said is something that I think many of us in the room agree with. To follow up, I have a question about the master plan. I understand that is it a 20 or a 30-year plan?
20.
20. My concern is, and perhaps you've already built this into the plan, that 20 years in our era of rapid climate change is such a long time that there is absolutely no way to anticipate where we're going to be in 20 years. And I just would like to know if the plan has the flexibility to do some changing rapidly. In other words, you won't feel locked into a 20-year plan if climate takes us to a new place in 5 years that the master plan did not anticipate. I guess that's a question. So.
Yeah, so typically master plans have a 20-year planning window, and every 5 years you do what's called a master plan update or a capital improvement plan update. So we look at things at a 5-year iterations to look back at projections and double check and redo cost estimates. I mean, you can see costs have gone through the roof on a lot of construction as well. So we take a fresh look at all that usually every 5 years.
Yes?
Judy Barber. Since this is such a long-range plan, I wondered whether we've put thought into water reuse and other sources. For instance, in golf courses, often they collect rainwater and use wastewater to turn it into gray water to do the irrigation. And there may be many other opportunities like that. The same with wastewater treatment plants. They can actually take and convert wastewater into drinking water, and then desalinization. So I'm wondering if we're looking at all types of water reuse as well as other sources of water.
Yeah, I can comment on the reuse, the infiltration piece, and we're looking at that with our own wastewater treatment plant. Our current permit, requires us to go 1.75 million gallons a day at the ocean outfall, and then any above that goes to our filter beds, the beds at the plant off of Camelot Drive. Our goal is to modify that permit to really, allow for an increase in shellfishing, water quality in the harbor. And at some point, we're hoping, next year or two, hopefully, we can modify or amend our permit with the state so we can infiltrate that instead of using the ocean outfall from the plant, infiltrate the beds off of Camelot Drive to recharge the aquifer. We feel that the quality coming out of the plant is pretty good, very good, and we can do that, and I'm pretty confident DEP will support us in that venue. But that's one thing we're doing. Again, that's a conversation maybe with the planning board and the zoning board on those private development projects as far as their reuse and what they can do for new projects and looking at those when they build them. I don't know if anybody at the table has comments on that.
Yeah, on the desalination, we looked at that as a potential alternative, and as I'm only aware of 2 other plants in Massachusetts. There's one in Swansea and one in Dayton, I think, for Aquaria, and in Brockton, a plant. So they're almost cost prohibitive at this point. They're very expensive. I would have to look up the cost per gallon, to be honest with you, but we didn't look at it because we didn't think it would be a good solution. As of right now, I feel like there's some the infrastructure projects that we proposed to meet the capital needs felt like they were more cost effective than desalination at this point.
Any other questions? It's almost 9 o'clock. Happy to take any questions, but what I will say is I thought it's a great meeting. Very good informative meeting, and what we'll do is, we'll circle back internally in the town and put some information out and come up with a game plan in moving this forward. What we'll do is, we'll concentrate on those areas that we've heard a lot of comments on, and, took pretty good notes this evening. Conservation, private wells, drinking water, downtown, all those type of things. We'll kind of put together a summary and like a narrative so we can post that so people can see it. I know PAC TV will run this, so we'll kind of, sit back and feel this out a little bit more and come up with a game plan and let everybody know. Okay? If anybody, again, hasn't signed the sign-in sheet, please give us your contact information and an email address so we can communicate with you. And thank you very much for your time this evening. Have a good night.